Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this session of the Azure Cloud Security Meetup group. Hello, Raymond. How you doing?
Hello, David. I'm fine, and you? Busy man.
Yeah, doing good. Thanks. Doing good. How's your week been?
Uh,
Been a busy.
let's
Yeah,
say fine. Let's say fine. Too
that's
much
that's
job,
that's
but let's say it's fine. It's fine.
awesome.
And you?
So I'm hearing, by the way, the reason why I'm pausing is because I'm hearing some background feeds. Okay, yeah, I think that's good now. Okay, so we do have an amazing session today. So we have someone who's probably, I think he's definitely been around since the beginning of the MVP program, right? So we have Martin, and Martin will be speaking to us on a very exciting topic. So I will be going through that today. But before we do that, if you're yet to join the Meetup group, what are you waiting for? So I'll put the link in the chat window. So make sure you join the Meetup group. So that's where you'll be notified of upcoming sessions that we have. So we have Martin that will be speaking to us on an amazing um, topic today. And next week, we'll also have another event where we'll have Liron that will be speaking to us on another topic. So that's all posted in the community. So make sure you follow the community page to be notified. So I guess that we're just going to go ahead and bring Martin on now. Hello, Martin. How are you doing?
Hey, David. Hey, Ibrahima. I'm doing fine. Good evening.
Yeah. So which airport are you currently at the moment? are
Yes,
you on, are
I,
you on your way to which conference?
no, I'm actually at home here in Holland, in cold and rainy Holland. But I've been traveling quite a bit over the past few weeks. Lucky to be in various really nice places like Microsoft's Israel Engineering Center in Redmond. We've
Awesome.
seen each other in Miami, so I've been around.
Yeah, and very very interesting conferences that that you've been to. You were recently at like the Blue Hat conference, I guess, which is very interesting conference from Microsoft talking about with a focus on security. So how was that for
Absolutely.
you, like the event and everything?
Yeah, Blue Hat was nice. I went to the US version in February earlier this month, and lots of great sessions. There was a wonderful keynote by Mark Razinovich, who also talked about AI and the challenges we're seeing on the security space with AI. And I guess every conference needs an AI talk, but yeah, the 2 day Blue Hat was nice. Also to network, to see people again. And later next month, there'll actually be a Blue Hat in Israel,
Oh
and they're very
wow.
different. So the US version, we had very different topics than the ones in Israel, but both are really, really nice.
Awesome. That's really nice. I didn't know about that. See, you need any information on what's going on in the Microsoft sphere, in the security sphere, you need to be following Martin. We'll put his information in the chat window.
Yeah,
So
and
make sure
thank
you
you
follow
for
Martin.
referencing to me as being long in the MVP program. I feel like an MVP, an MV dinosaur.
It's true. Ibrahima can testify, right? Am I lying, Ibrahima? Martin has probably been around since the very beginning stages, right?
Well,
Of like the
it's been a
MVP.
while, at
Yes.
least 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah, like how long have you like heard like Martin's name in the Microsoft security community? I know like for me it was years ago when I was working for a security company in Oxford. But how long was it for you, Ibrahima, that you first heard of Martin's name?
Probably 3 or 2 years, 2 years ago, I think.
Ah, yeah, nice.
Yeah, I guess you're a dinosaur yourself, David, because you've been around quite a while as well.
No, I was mainly like just learning and in the background. So, but your blogs and everything has definitely helped a lot of us through the year. So, thanks very much for that.
No,
Okay,
and thank you, guys, for having me tonight. Absolutely. Yeah.
we're very glad to have you here. So, we're gonna hand over to Martin now. So, it's gonna introduce himself and he's gonna introduce like the topic. And if you have any questions, one of the things that we try to do is we try to have as much conversation as possible. So, put your questions in the chat window. You have Martin here. It's going to be difficult before you catch him the next time. So make sure you put your questions in the chat window. We will bring them up to him at the end, and I'm sure that Martin will be happy to address them. But for now, we'll hand over to you, Martin. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you everybody for tuning in tonight. I know it's going to be me between you and dinner, so thank you for tuning into my session. The session's called 52 Minutes from Initial Access to Ransomware. Is your defensive team ready? And I guess we're going to talk a bit about how fast and how agile the attacks are evolving in the current threat landscape. So, as far as the agenda, we'll talk a bit about the threat actors that we can categorize mainly into three buckets, and talk a bit about how they act and what their motives are. We'll also talk a bit about timeline and tactics, like how do they go about, how fast does things escalate from an initial access to an impact and ransomware. What are their techniques, their tools, their weapons, if you will, to perform this. And we'll also talk a bit about the defensive recommendation and the defensive things you can do in your infrastructure and on your endpoints and on other places to make things harder for the adversary to go and realize their motive. And we'll end, of course, by doing some key takeaways. So, for those that don't know me yet, I'm Maarten Goet. As said, I live in the Netherlands. You could follow me on any of the social mediums I'm on. I've been an MVP since 2007, so I've been around for a while, and I'm also a regional director since 2015, focusing on Azure endpoints and security. And I work as the director of cybersecurity for Wortel, running our 24/7 cybersecurity center, again from Holland for our Western European customers. So, in this session, we'll be looking a bit to have some humor. And I guess you don't need to see me as a stand-up comedian. I won't be the next Seinfeld. But with humor, I mean the human-operated ransomware. So they're targeting to place some ransomware in your environment, but they're humans, they're financial groups involved, and we'll have a look a bit about how that works. It is based on a real-world case, so this is not something just made out of textbooks. This is something we saw from our Cyber Defense Center, and so this is really based on a real-world case. So just to level set everybody on the same page, let's first zoom into the threat actors and just have a look at who are trying to cause havoc in our environments and to our applications. So to me, if you look at threat actors, you could categorize them roughly into three buckets. And I guess the first bucket is an individual, typically referenced as, let's say, a script kiddie, maybe a teenager, somebody who's trying to do some opportunistic damage. And this could be if it's a teenager that he or she is losing a game. They've learned how to stand up a small botnet, for instance, to make sure that the connection of their fellow gamers is impacted so that he or she could win. But the same techniques they learn on those forums, the techniques they find through their Discord channels, could of course be weaponized, if you will, against critical services. So let's say an internet front end of an online bank. If you send enough traffic, if you pass on a DDoS, then certainly you could bring those front ends down to their knees if they're not well set up with certain protection. So certain individuals, let's say script kiddies, teenagers, could opportunistically try and cause some problems by, for instance, setting up botnets, DDoS, and what have you. Or they do coincidentally find some sort of vulnerability on an online service. They try and exploit it, and perhaps, hopefully, for fame and name, they'll contact you to get it remediated. But these are individuals. They don't have a lot of money. They perhaps have the time. I'm not sure about skill sets. It will depend on their profession and their professionality, but they will likely be just by themselves. The second category, or the second bucket, if you will, would be the financially motivated groups. They have, like the name says, a reason to target you because they're after your money. This is an economy, if you will, a fraudulent economy, but they're trying to get money from you by placing ransomware or trying to extort you for you to wire some sort of cryptocurrency into their wallets. And these financial groups, they're very diverse. It's often a web of groups. Certain groups will be responsible for building encryption techniques. Certain groups will be responsible for selling initial access to environments. And certain groups might be active to really exploit an environment, do the lateral movement, place the ransomware, and even collect the money, if you will. And these financial groups, they are organized often quite professionally, large number of people involved. And because it's economy, because they're making good money, they're actually well organized from a financial standpoint as well. And these are the groups we often see in the news. They breach into environments, big names get hacked, get ransomware, and a certain financial group might claim that fame. The third bucket, if you will, is what you would say the political groups or the nation states. And they have a political motive, perhaps even a destructive motive, to target another country or a critical infrastructure in a company, or enterprises, for instance, for intelligence gathering, IP stealing, etc. So these nation states are often active. We don't know a lot because the intelligence agencies are trying to find those courses of action. Microsoft, with its Threat Intelligence Center, does share quite a bit of information about it. But in general, these are lesser known to the general public and also harder to spot because in the end, they will have an almost infinite amount of money and perhaps even an almost infinite amount of people from intelligence agencies or other government agencies trying to do the work. And the lines blur a bit between those financial groups and those nation states. If you look at, for instance, Russia, we saw last year that Conti, one of the famous groups over in the East, actually said we're loyal to the Russian cause, which brings them way closer into the orbit of the Russian government. So these are the three buckets I would recognize as potentials that we're trying to target your company or your environment. Now, going back to those motives, there's a couple of things to understand there. One motive could be fame. Again, looking at the individual, the script kiddie wants to make a name by itself or is stimulated by making sure that people know that he or she did it. So there's certainly fame, but we see the same thing with financial groups, right? Conti that deliberately tells us that they've hacked a certain environment or a certain company, and that we want to know or should know that they were the ones behind it. It could be revenge, certainly with an individual, some sort of damage because he or she had problems to begin with, and they want to take revenge on a friend or some other company that they are not excited about. And financially motives, of course, with the financial groups, it's all about the money. It's a ransomware economy, if you will, where they're driven by the money they could make by extorting you. Motives for nation states could be political. I'm trying to gain a political motive, maybe influence elections or other motives. It could be intelligence. I'd like to gather information about a critical infrastructure before physical things happen, or to steal intellectual property. Or it could be destruction, like we saw in Ukraine, where Russia was trying to first harm the energy network by cyber means before they were actually grabbing the rockets to do the same thing physically. Now, I would say ransomware has come quite far. Over the past 10, 12 years, we've seen quite a progression because back then, typically ransomware or encryption of a system was the name of the game. So they were targeting individual systems. They were shooting with hail, broad targeting, narrow impact, trying to hit 1 million systems and maybe getting through to 1, 2, 3, or 4. It was very opportunistic from a data encryption standpoint. They would just have 1 or 2 algorithms, and hopefully the system they were targeting would catch on to the data encryption method. And it was really unlikely yet to cause any catastrophic business disruption. because it was just one system and not certainly the whole company back then. Defense typically was still via malware prevention, so antivirus heuristics, certain rules from AV that could prevent the known actors and the known files and the known modes of operation. Now, going back to the human-operated ransom era that we live in now, we see that they're very narrowly targeting an entire company. They might do some open source reconnaissance ahead of time, trying to find out what is the company, what are the applications they're using, what are the people working there, what is the best time to target them, what would be a good ransomware amount if we do get them to encrypt. So they're targeting the really entire company. The attack will likely be driven and determined by human intelligence. Like I said, they're doing the reconnaissance, they're making a profile of your company, they're customizing it for you and your company only, and they're trying to get through based on that intelligence. And if you know what applications you're using, what platforms you're using, and potentially what operating systems you're using, they could do a very calculated and specific data encryption method before running those. And likely it's not only encryption, it's also exfiltration, but we'll talk about that in a second. If they do get through, and if you do get encrypted, then it's guaranteed almost to cause catastrophic and visible business disruption. And visible in the sense that you won't be operating and likely be coming into the news soon. And if you want to do a successful defense, that means that we need some sort of holistic approach. It's not about one AV protection just for the operating system. We need to do things for our identities, our applications, networking, as much things as we can to make the attack surface smaller and harder for them to move beyond one point that they've then potentially have breached. Now, talking about the encryption. So the visible thing we often see, and certainly something that gets a lot of news coverage, is where the company is breached and encryption occurs and the ransomware node is displayed. And the ransomware node says, well, you can get access back to your files if you pay this and this amount of cryptocurrency, and then we'll share a key with you. It will likely be a very targeted encryption, high fidelity, so decryption will be hard. It might be a better way to backup or get back to your backup and do a restore if you have the time and the effort to do so. But they're trying to do the double extortion. So before they actually run the encryption, it's quite likely that they've found in your environment something that's worth a lot to you. It might be the intellectual property of a processor schema. It might be your recipe for a certain drink. It might be something else that your company runs on to sell their businesses. So what they'll likely do is copy those specific files, those valuable files, into some sort of cloud storage they own before sending the encryption on its way and ransom note displayed. And that means that even if you decide on restoring your environment, rebuilding it, not negotiating with that group and not paying the money, they could still do the double extortion and say, well, if you don't pay me, I will still release these files to the general public or to your competitor. Or if you're, for instance, on a stock exchange, this will impact your the value of your company because this data will be on publicly available files. So the double extortion means they have two opportunities to make sure that from their standpoint, you hopefully pay them their money. Now, I've already said that this is quite an economy and that there's multiple groups involved. And Microsoft describes it as ransomware as a service because, again, groups could be providing the encryption and tooling, some other groups selling you the initial access to an environment, some groups running it. And so from Microsoft's research early last year, there's access brokers selling access to compromised networks to ransomware as a service affiliates who then run the ransomware attack. And out of the 2,500 potential targeted orgs, about 60 encounter activity associated with known ransomware attackers. So ransomware as a service affiliates prioritize those targets, and they figure out the intended impact or the perceived profit they can get from those targets. And out of those 60, 20 are actually successfully compromised. So they find some sort of weakness in the network and progress from there on. And then out of those 20, one really sees a fully successfully ransomware event. Your files are encrypted, and again, potentially even your IP exfiltrated. And this is the culmination of a chain of those malicious events. And you would say, well, one out of 2,500 is not a lot. Well, it is actually, because if you look at the number of companies that we have, organizations worldwide, but certainly in the UK or in Europe, this means that a lot of organizations could potentially see that ransomware event happening, so they need to start taking measures. Now, attributing that attack to a certain group could be very hard. We see all sorts of interesting names popping up on grouping that are referenced for a certain attack. And of course, if a certain group is claiming the fame, there's a higher chance that they are really behind it. But from, again, Microsoft's research, we see that these same groups are switching methods quite a bit. And that means that even though, for instance, in January 2021, this particular group called Dev0504 was using Ryuk ransomware, over the time of that spring, they switched to Revol, they switched to Lockbit, Black Matter, and all the way up to Black Hat at this point. So Microsoft is observing this group and really seeing that they're changing their way of operation against targets. And again, that's possible because groups will be evolving those tools, techniques, and other groups can take advantage of them by buying those toolings or buying those initial access tokens. Now, if you're interested in how these groups operate, how they're named, how their mode of operandi is, Microsoft releases each year a report called the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. And it gives you an at-a-glance overview of the threat landscape, and it's a free download you can take from their website. And it has really, really interesting information in it. And one of the things that I found quite interesting is that of the nation states that are actually trying to target other environments, 4 out of 10 are targeting critical infrastructure, which means that our nation's most important assets are under attack from those nation states. And this is also why the European Union, and I guess the UK is on a similar initiative, is trying to mandate that countries to shape up their defenses, and certainly that critical companies within the country, so the energy suppliers, our harbors and whatnot, should supply more defenses and work on their security. And this is something called the NIS2 directive that will come into effect October next year. Now, here's a sample of nation-state actors and their activities, and you could almost instantly see that at least 4 of the big axes of evil, if you will, are represented here. So you see Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China added, where certainly some of the elements are named where they're trying to target defense industry, government, personnel, critical infrastructure, and OT. So this is just one page of the Digital Defense Report, and I saw that David pasted it in the chat, so go ahead and have a look at that Digital Defense Report, if you will. It has really, really nice insights. Again, also insights that we normally even wouldn't have. Now, that means that we're quite busy with all of those attacks. And the British government actually sent a tweet last November where ransomware incidents are now making up the majority of the British government's crisis management meetings, the recent COBRA meetings, because there are so many attacks of them happening. And I guess a lot of progress to be made by us to put up our defenses. So this illustrates and I guess underlines the need to come into action. Now, if you're a bit dazzled about all of these things I'm talking about, I want to point out that there is a non-profit organization called MITRE. And MITRE describes the actors, the techniques, the tactics, the tools, the TTPs, if you will, of those attacks. They are becoming almost a de facto standard, and they're open sourcing, they're publicly sharing this information with you. There are specific attack matrices for enterprise environments, so our cloud environments, our on-prem environments, also for ICS and SCADA, so the operational critical environments. And these things really help because they try and categorize and make sense to you on the things that you should put defenses on. So what are the actors that could target my industry, my company? What are the techniques they are trying to use? What are the tools, and how could we potentially detect them? Are the things you would get from MITRE, and they have a wonderful website you could visit. Now, there's about 12 phases that they see the kill chain moving through. Of course, there's phases in front, like the open source public investigations that actors are doing, reconnaissance on the outside. This is certainly not something we can potentially detect. So MITRE tries to describe the phases that has the potential for detection. So the initial access, finding that vulnerability on the outside, discovering the company and the environment, executing some sort of code for the malware or certainly the communication channels to start flowing to the actor, laterally moving through your environment, trying to persist. So even if connections go down or they get blocked out, trying to put something in your environment to persist throughout the length of the attack, collecting information, trying to escalate from a regular account to multiple privileges like a cloud admin or a domain admin, having a command and control channel to send controls to their workers, defense evasion, trying to undercut any of the AV or EDRs, exfiltrating data like we talked about, credential access and impact is really the category where ransomware and encryption starts, and it's almost game over by the time you see the ransomware note. So this is just a small intro on the world of threat actors. So let's have a quick look at timeline and tactics. And the most important part I would see is that there are 5 buckets, 5 ways, if you will, to gain that initial access into your environment. And you see some of the T numbering here in the screen, and those T numbers reference a MITRE article. So if you type this number in a MITRE, you'll actually find way more information about it. And I'll be sharing the slides later on, of course, so you can have a look. So category 1 is they're trying to exploit vulnerabilities in your internet-facing services. Could be some RDP opened up on the internet. It could be something on an application server, some sort of zero-day in some sort of service. But it's a vulnerability that exists on the internet-facing side of your company that then provides them with a jump into the environment. Second bucket is where they're trying to abuse internet-facing authentication mechanisms. So Azure AD, Okta, maybe some proprietary login to an informational system. They're trying to abuse it so that they have some sort of credential that they can now use to get into the environment further. Category 3 would be phishing for malware execution. So trying to exploit human behavior to get something done that is running in the context of that user. Category 4, physical access to a network, still quite relevant, where some warehouse or some connected network gets breached and they gain access to a physical part of your network. Unplugging a printer, adding a Raspberry Pi or some other thing is still quite a thing for targeted attacks. And of course, 5 would be supply chain attacks. And you could consider it 2 ways. Supply chain could be some sort of supplier, my IT partner that has an account in my environment that is now breached, and therefore my environment is breached. Or supply chain attacks like software packages that you run in your environment because you run a NuGet or a WinGet or some PowerShell module or something that is part of a bigger software deployment in a pipeline or what have you. So these are the things that you could think about as how they could gain access into your environment from a category standpoint. Now, Microsoft says that 61% of all ransomware attacks have some sort of start with an identity. And that makes a lot of sense because identity is really the new control plane. It makes sure that we're authenticated, that we are authorized to get somewhere. All of our services, whether they are on-prem or in the cloud or somewhere else, they will require this identity to get access to. And of course, with the pandemic and remote working, this really accelerated. Again, talking about supply chain, that means that vendors will have identity access to our environments. And who doesn't recognize the fact that often we have way too many rights on an account, way too much access to a resource, and who does the evaluation of accounts periodically? I still see companies struggling really to get this right. So yeah, identity is really quite a service that we need to worry about. If you look at Microsoft's digital defense report, they state that every minute they see about 77,000 attempts for Azure AD. So things like password spray attacks or brute forcing or whatnot. Of course, they're blocking them, but it does underline the fact that adversaries are trying to abuse identities to get access. Now, spearfishing still is quite a thing. Why? Because it tries to exploit our human behavior. Who doesn't recognize a file share that you get sent in email? It looks almost real, and before you know it, the user clicks on it and does something they probably shouldn't have. And looking at that human behavior, well, effective spearfishing patterns really try to exploit that behavior. So a coworker or a spearfishing email trying to mimic a coworker that wants to schedule a meeting for tomorrow with some urgency. Click here to find a date and a time. Or social media. Have you seen my latest picture of this cat laughing out loud? Or the Dropbox or OneDrive that we just saw where files are shared. These are just typical patterns that are still very today effectively exploiting our human behavior. So what happens when we click on those spearfishing emails is typically there's some sort of man-in-the-middle attack. They mimic our Microsoft login page, but if you closely look at the URL in the top window, then users could see, of course, that they're not going through the Microsoft services, but some other staged service from an adversary. You put in your name and your password, and they capture those going forward. Now, of course, you could say, well, what if I have multi-factor authentication configured? They wouldn't come very far, would they? Yeah, well, that is true. But on the other hand, let's look at the Uber attack that happened just over a year ago. They will just spam you. They will just try to get you to hit approve because you're getting fed up with all of those notifications. Try it 100 times. There's a good chance that the user will just click approve because then those notifications will go away. And this is, of course, what we call MFA spamming. And this was actually the most recent proof that this works in the Uber attack, where a supplier was actually MFA spammed and they got access to the environment. And also, if you look at nation states, and here is a tweet from the CERT of Ukraine in October 22 last year, they detected spearfishing against the government themed with the armed forces, trying to get them to click on some rom-com backdoor. So this is certainly not just something that financial groups will do. This is certainly also something that comes in the orbit of nation states. So let's look at a real world attack. What happens? We have this initial access. There is perhaps some spearfishing going on. There's a man-in-the-middle attack. We harvest the password. We're trying MFA spam up to the point that somebody says approve. Boom, we got our first access token. Now we need to enroll a device that's controlled by us, by the actor, and change the MFA settings for that account so that we can approve those sign-in requests going forward. And this is not something where I would need 100 Android phones to make this happen. No, there are publicly available tools like Dirk Jan's Road Tools. If you Google those, that is a really neat repository that Dirk Jan Mollema built with all sorts of scripting and a framework that allows us to do this kind of work and to get that persistence on enrollment and MFA. So then they worry about persisting along their whole route. So they add a scheduled task, executing SSH daemon. They're running services that execute a Cobalt Strike daemon so that they get a command and control channel. And again, this is a matter of minutes. We're only 6 minutes in, and we already got the first persistence going. From that point on, we'd like to move from one machine to another. So using RDP, perhaps some InPacket, PSExec, other services that are available to us in that environment, or perhaps even a remote service creation so that we can jump from one box to another. Again, just minutes onward. We find our first credentials, clear text through enabling wdigest in Windows Server, and we get access to the Azure directory, the Active Directory, with volume shadow copies and the NTDS util, trying to access the ntds.dit. Then we start disabling the antivirus through a vulnerable anti-rootkit driver, and we exfiltrate data through SCP, and we masquerade the process to look like the identity process in Windows, but we subtract an S and we just call it lss.exe so that hopefully those detections from that company won't pick it up. And we start the encryption, and the first ransomware nodes start getting displayed on servers. Again, just 52 minutes from the first time that the adversary got initial access. And that is a short time. So encryption starts. And the question we could have is, how much time does it take to encrypt about 100,000 files? And again, this is based on your processor type, your disk speed. I know there's a lot of variables. But let's take a median time on an average Windows server. Let's say it's about 60 gigs or less. Who thinks it's 8 hours? Who thinks it's 3 hours or 21 minutes or 4 minutes? Well, I can tell you it's 4 minutes. This is a reference from an article that you can see on zdnet.com, how they averaged the encryption time on certain servers. And this is not something that starts in parallel. They're not going to do server 1 first, then go on to server 2. Everything goes parallel. That means that in just a matter of minutes, we'll see your whole environment getting locked down and ransomware nodes displayed. Actually, Microsoft says destructive human-operated ransomware breach to your full environment is just 15 minutes. So there's ample time really to do anything. And we really need to do this at the speed of machines and the speed of machine scale. Okay, this scares us a lot. We need to up our defenses. Maarten, what are your defensive recommendations? Well, good question. I would say start with the identity, of course. Do the Azure AD password protection. This is something, certainly if you're not using a custom password list that's just available to you. But if you want to do some nice extra features, there are paid versions where you can do more. You could add identity protection, maybe add some sort of risk policy, look at when to require multi-factor authentication in combination perhaps with the conditional access policies, and really look at anomalies and odd behavior in your environment for it to start enforcing extra controls to make sure that your identity is safe. And of course, if you're using MFA, which is great, just start adding the number matching. It makes it harder for the user to just click approve. They need to go into the Authenticator app, type over the number, hit OK, maybe do a face or a fingerprint recognition, and make sure that it's harder for them to do the MFA spamming. And guess what? In May of this year, so in about 3 months, Microsoft will start mandating this for your MFA deployment. So start preparing your users today that number matching is coming to them. And this is actually a good thing to up our security. Of course, if you're still just on an AV solution, consider some sort of EDR, because we do need to do more than just look at heuristics. We need to find behavior, certain networks behavior, and Microsoft Defender for Endpoint can do that. We have the integration on the network. We can do it multi-platform on Linux. We even have for iOS and Android, of course, the Windows Server and Windows clients. And one part of Microsoft Defender in conjunction with those identity tooling is that we can do automatic attack disruption at machine speed. So whenever we see that pattern happening, directly block a user or remove access or do whatever feels logical for that attack before there's even a human involved who can then evaluate the alert and the challenges. And Defender for Endpoint will likely find all of these things that will be hard for you to see, like the Cobalt Strike beacons that are getting embedded in your environment, like the low-hanging fruit, a scheduled task that is created that shouldn't be there because they're trying to use it for persistence. Microsoft Defender for Endpoint will look at Impacket, trying to simulate certain protocols in your environment, or the NTDS util dumping, where we find that they're trying to use volume shadow copies to get access to your Active Directory. And certainly also with the false kernel drivers, those are the things that are getting picked up by MDE and shown as alerts or getting blocked before even getting executed. And again, when they're trying to shut down some of the AV, these are the things that get picked up and prevented before time. And we can do the hunting on finding all of the commands that they were doing in your environment. Now, Microsoft Defender nicely maps it into all of the MITRE categories. And you see that here in the screenshot. We've got a couple of attacks happening, 5 MITRE attacks involved, 5 categories, 1 impacted device. And from here on, we can actually click into those details. Now, if you want to add other environments, Amazon, GCP, if you want to add your operational technology from your factory or some other critical infrastructure, you can hook up the Defender suite into Sentinel and really broaden the umbrella of the things that you're trying to secure. So Microsoft Sentinel will allow you to bridge those gaps between IT and OT, Microsoft, non-Microsoft, networking, and all of these other services that you want to care about. And again, it will also broaden the capabilities for you to hunt in your environment, not only on endpoints, but any of those data sources that you'll be adding to Sentinel. Now, looking in your environment, you might have a lot of resources and you might think, where do I begin to harden or set up some extra defenses? Well, John Lambert, who's the head of Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center, has a wonderful quote called "Defenders think in lists, attackers think in graphs, and as long as this is true, attackers win." Because they're trying to go through the path of the least resistance. They're trying to figure out what would be the easiest way to come from machine 1 to 2, from account A to B, and reach my goal of trying to exfiltrate that intellectual property or trying to encrypt certain valuable infrastructure so that you start paying ransom. And this is where Microsoft Defender 365 tries to summarize all of these attacks into a graph-style view. So you see here that there's multiple alerts happening. They get correlated by machine, IP, resource, file hash, identity, whatever, and then nicely displayed in a timeline so that you can actually have more insights into that attack. And here's a high-fidelity screenshot. We see possible attempts to discover groups. We see reconnaissance. We see the Mimikatz hack tool. All of these things very logically sorted and related into each other so that we can have an at-a-glance view of the things happening and where to move next. And of course, from here on out, we can dive into details on the right-hand side, get more insights, and also stop and quarantine some of these behavior. So Microsoft Defender builds these attack paths. What if I want to understand for more my environment, what would be potential attack paths? How would they go from a specific app into a service principal, into some sort of highly privileged account in my Azure AD tenant? Well, this is something where a public available tool, Azure Hound, comes around the corner. You could run a query against your on-prem Azure, Active Directory with Bloodhound, but you could also run an inventory of your Azure AD and your Azure tenants. This is called Azure Hound. It also brings a graph database, and you could use visualization the same way to say, okay, from this specific machine or from this specific identity, what is the shortest path to my next goal? So a certain domain admin, a global tenant admin, etc. If you don't want to run this manually, then Microsoft Defender for Cloud actually, during Ignite last year, released a really new cool feature that tries to also show you the attack paths for your environment based on the things we find in your Azure subscriptions, in your Azure tenants, and what have you. So here's an example of Microsoft Defender for Cloud showing you an internet exposed VM with critical vulnerabilities that have high privileged permissions to a subscription. It gives you the chain of the IP address, the virtual machine, the subscription, gives detail of the account used, and you can actually from there on go into what's called EASM, the External Attack Surface Management, and potentially revoke some rights, change your infrastructure layout or other things that you want to do to really make that attack path go away and make sure that your attack surface is as small as you can. And this is, of course, available for Microsoft Azure, but like Azure Defender is available for any cloud, we can do the same thing for our EC2 instances in AWS, and certainly later on with Google GCP as well. So my key takeaways for tonight would be, well, consider the fact that the NIS2 legislation and directive is coming into effect next year, October. So many critical companies in Europe and about will have to have something in place before that time that makes our defenses better. So have a plan in general. Think about how we're going to approach this problem. And I would say start with securing your identities, because it's, again, 61% of the start of some ransomware activity. You want to get some visibility, get an EDR, get an XDR, get a SIM. Consider Microsoft Defender, consider Microsoft Sentinel as cloud services. Learn Microsoft security, and of course, visit David's meetup to learn more in the future. And consider an MDR service. If you don't have the crew to support this 24/7, around the clock, then you will likely need a provider to help you with this. Microsoft will be able to help you with the technology. It is multi-cloud. There are lots of partner solutions that you can integrate. Defender and Sentinel play really nice together. If you're really interested in those attacks happening on Azure AD, on Azure Hound, on all of the MITRE attack tools and techniques that are applicable to Azure AD, there's a wonderful free playbook called the Azure AD Attack and Defense Playbook. Again, it references all of the MITRE techniques that are applicable. It's on github.com, and you can download it for free. So there's a lot of things you can do from an identity perspective that you can take from this playbook. Now, if you're interested in ransom payments, there's one thing I'd like to highlight, because it's quite known that Thales, the French group, was ransomed for the first time a couple of years ago, and it's alleged that they would have been paying. And that in November 7th of last year, that they were hit for the second time after they were first posted in 2021, which means that once you start paying ransom, there's a quite likelihood that these groups will know that you're vulnerable and that you're willing to pay. So why not try it a second time? If you want to try it out yourself, Financial Times, ft.com, has a really nice free simulator. And again, I'll be sharing the links afterwards, where you can try and negotiate your way out of a ransomware attack. You could be on the organization side as the CFO, CISO, or engineer, and certainly on the adversary side, and trying to make choices and see what the impact you have. So certainly something you could try. And again, I'll share the URL so you can try it yourself. A couple of resources. My colleague Jeffrey Appel, who's also an MVP, has lots of Microsoft Defender content on his site. It's in English, so check it out. He's also releasing his ebook, his free ebook this month, so do get subscribed to his website. Mark Simos has really nice architecture views that gives you those insights, for instance, for the defense report. I've got a YouTube channel with some videos if you'd like to check it out, and the company is called Wortel.nl. I would leave you with the fact that we are no longer securing computers. We are really securing society. So we need to make sure that our critical infrastructure is protected well, to make sure that our fellow citizens are well taken care of. Great. That was my talk.
Awesome. That's so amazing. Thanks very much for that, Maarten. That was amazing. Wow.
Thank you.
So the number one question, which was one that I've asked you before, like how long did it take you to create the slides?
Yeah, there's a lot of detail in it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And again, it looks very, very, very professional. So someone did ask a question earlier. Are you going to be sharing the slides with us? And yeah,
I will
so
be, absolutely.
yeah. And one of the things that I'll probably do right now is I'll go ahead and I'll put Maarten's Twitter handle in the chat window, or just search for Maarten Goet's name. Did I pronounce your last name correctly this time? I was trying to learn it when you pronounced it the last time. So
yeah, I tell the people that if you look at it at HOOD and think like hood, that is the closest you could get to the Dutch pronunciation of goed.
Good. Awesome. So okay, so while we're waiting for questions, let me see. Okay, so I can see everything. It's been a very, very interesting session, and I completely agree. So I do have like a question for you. We've been hearing ransomware for quite a long time now, right? Do you foresee that this is something that will carry on for quite a long time, or do you think that at some point there will be newer technologies that will sort of like essentially make this really like something that we don't really look at like anymore? Or is it something that for the next foreseeable future we should we should get used to this?
No, I think I must admit that coming back from Blue Hat early this month, I was a bit depressed on the fact that things are escalating, that adversaries are getting better, and that it's still quite an uneven game as far as defenses versus attack. But yeah, things that will change, of course, is with AI and machine learning. But I guess for the foreseeable future, this is something we need to worry about, and yeah, we won't have a lack of jobs or work in the cybersecurity space going forward.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And again, like it's just such a very interesting one because it's been quite around for quite a long time, and it's just, I guess it's just evolving with like the times at all. So one of the things that you mentioned, like you did mention something around like the issue of like supply chain attacks, which is an area that we've been looking at in terms of trying to understand what's going on in like those sort of areas. So is this something that we're also beginning to see like more ransomware like targeting like dev environment also, or is that something that's mainly still about organization data focused and maybe like enterprise data focused?
Yeah, I think we're seeing quite an escalation there, because who is checking the packages that you run on your environments? If you do in PowerShell get module, are you checking that your DNS isn't hijacked, that you're not doing typo squatting instead of AZ account, it's a triple C? Or in a NuGet package that there's some sort of rogue code that was actually in a pull request in a public repo. So I think there needs to be more technical measures on those platforms, on our systems, to make sure that we can't have those mistakes and really block out the low-hanging fruit. But certainly from like software development, you have an obligation from a security perspective to really understand your supply chain. But again, supply chain to me is also like managed service providers to companies, where somebody has access to your environment, they are a supplier to you, and they have an identity or some sort of principle in your environment. How are you auditing them? How are you checking them? How do you know that this is not a stepping stone for you to get breached?
Very, very interesting. So I think I'll let Sakofi or
Yeah.
Ibrahim might have any questions for Maarten before we round up the for
Yeah,
today.
absolutely. Yeah, Maarten, thank you for the session. It's been a wonderful session. I've really learned a lot. But one question I really wanted to ask is actually that I know, I mean, for the last 5 years, we've been preaching a lot of security, trying to encourage, let's say, DevSecOps, ensuring the security is part of the whole pipeline. From your point, do you see that companies are really adopting it? I know in a bad actors side, if there's a business for them to make money, if people are still paying the ransomware, they will carry on doing it. So from your side, you see that companies are now adapting the approach of ensuring the security mindset is really taken care of during their, let's say, processes or creating of applications.
Yeah, I must see we're seeing a bit of a shift because, like you said previously, they were very much calculating what's my business case for paying versus rebuilding the infrastructure, and they sometimes were willing to negotiate to get a key. Or they would say, well, I've got insurance, so we'll see what happens, which of course is not the way to go about it. But certainly now with this legislation and these laws getting into to effect, the chiefs of a company, the main responsible for security in the company, the CEO, etc., will be personally liable going forward if something happens. That means that up until October next year, they need to get something in place, because if not, and they get breached, somebody could be prosecuted personally because they didn't spend the time, money, and resources to get their defenses up. So we're seeing now boards really starting to worry, like, okay, now that I'm personally liable, I might need to start doing something.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So far as now, it depends. Someone have to hold the responsibility. It looks like it's definitely going to enforce companies to really adapt security much better.
Yeah, and hopefully it will be intrinsic motivation, so it's not something that just is done because there's a law, but certainly because they want to make sure the company is safe, like they also have fences or video cameras or something that they care about from a physical building. You would hope that over time this becomes an intrinsic motivator, but the law will help really push this forward and put it on the board's agenda.
Absolutely.
Yeah, awesome.
Right, thank you.
So I think that we've run out of time already. Maarten, again, thanks very much. We understand, we know how busy you are. So we really, really appreciate you taking the time to come.
Well, and thank you for having me. Really enjoyed being with your user group.
Yeah, really, really, really appreciate it. So again, I've put Maarten's Twitter handle on the screen. So make sure you follow Maarten, and we'll be happy to have you back in the future again to come share some other information with us. So if there's no other question, thanks very much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Have a lovely rest of the day. See you all. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Cheers.